I know that those of you who have been hit hard by Katrina are suffering. Many are angry and desperate for help. The tasks before us are enormous, but so is the heart of America. In America, we do not abandon our fellow citizens in their hour of need. And the federal government will do its part. Where our response is not working, we'll make it right. Where our response is working, we'll duplicate it. We have a responsibility to our brothers and sisters all along the Gulf Coast, and we will not rest until we get this right and the job is done. This quote is part of a statement given by President George H.W. Bush on September 3, 2005, from the Rose Garden at the White House following Hurricane Katrina. Despite the president's words, many people were abandoned in their hour of need. Thousands of Americans with disabilities struggle to access information, to secure means to evacuate, and to find accessible shelters and more. With this lack of access, thousands perished or were left to weather the United States' most costly storm. Hello, I'm Clarissa Sanders, and this is Clarissa Explains, a podcast that explores historical events and why they matter. This season, we're taking a deep dive into the history of disasters in the United States and looking at how they've left an impact on communities, places, and laws. 20 years ago this month, Hurricane Katrina ripped through the Gulf Coast of the United States, leaving nothing but destruction in her wake. Over 1,800 people lost their lives due to the storm, failed infrastructure, and poor emergency planning. Today, we're going to talk about why Hurricane Katrina was such a devastating disaster, and more specifically, we're going to examine why it disproportionately impacted people with disabilities. We will also look at how, in the aftermath of Katrina, federal laws and emergency plans were changed in hopes to prevent similar injustices from happening in the future. On August 23, 2005, a tropical depression formed over the southeastern part of the Bahamas. The next day, as the storm moved towards central Bahamas, it was upgraded to a tropical storm and received the name Katrina. As the storm moved towards Florida, it continued to grow. On August 25th, just 2 hours before it reached land, the eye of the storm became apparent on radar and it was upgraded to a Category 1 hurricane. Katrina made landfall near Hallandale Beach, Florida, and spent about 6 hours over the state. As it moved, the storm lost speed and was briefly downgraded to a tropical storm again. Katrina quickly returned to hurricane status, though, as it reached the warm waters of the Gulf of Mexico and converted that heat into energy. On August 27th, the storm doubled in size and was classified as a Category 3 hurricane. The following day, in less than 12 hours, the storm reached its peak intensity and was classified as a Category 5 hurricane, with winds reaching 120 miles out from the storm's center. Katrina weakened to a Category 3 hurricane before it made a second landfall in Louisiana on August 29th, with recorded wind speeds of 140 miles per hour and stretching 400 miles across the coast. Katrina maintained its status as a Category 3 hurricane when it made a third landfall near the borders of Mississippi and Louisiana. In Mississippi, damaging winds from Katrina extended throughout the state, and all 82 counties were declared disaster areas. In New Orleans, the hurricane was just the first disaster to impact the city. The eye of the storm passed southeast of the city on August 29th. The winds caused damage, knocked out power, and made communication difficult, but it wasn't the wind that had people scared. New Orleans is situated about 6 feet below sea level and is surrounded by multiple bodies of water on all sides, putting the city at risk for flooding during storms. In order to combat this, the Army Corps of Engineers built levees and seawalls to protect the city, but this system wasn't well maintained due to underfunding and ultimately failed. An hour before the hurricane struck land, the Army Corps of Engineers were notified that the levees on the 17th Street Canal were breached and that the city was flooding. Storm surges sent water over the levees and seawalls in over 50 locations across New Orleans, flooding 80% of the city. Flooding decimated New Orleans. An estimated 100,000 people were still in the area during the storm, and with the water as high as 15 feet in some locations, rescue operations moved at a glacial pace. An estimated 1,500 people in Louisiana alone died due to the storm, with many of them drowning in the floodwaters. Millions of Americans all along the Gulf Coast were left homeless, and an estimated 400,000 people permanently left New Orleans following the disaster. Hurricane Katrina's destruction was widespread, but some communities and people groups were disproportionately impacted by the disaster. Predominantly Black, low-income neighborhoods were hit the hardest, which resulted in higher mortality rates and displacement rates for Black city residents than white. In 2006, a block-by-block analysis of census data compared to flood data showed that 3/4 of Black residents in New Orleans experienced serious flooding compared to just half of the city's white residents. Black and low-income residents also suffered from more housing damage and were more likely to be displaced longer than white residents. Residential segregation and land development led Black communities to be located in the low-lying sections of the city and thus experiencing the worst of the levee breaches. Elders were also disproportionately impacted by Hurricane Katrina. People over the age of 60 made up about 15% of New Orleans' population prior to the storm, but accounted for about 75% of the bodies found immediately after the disaster. As one woman put it, "Look at these old people. They're out here without their medication. They're in wheelchairs. We need help, sir. We really need help." Less than 60% of nursing homes in the city successfully evacuated patients. Reports also emerged a year after the disaster that staff at a hospital in the city euthanized long-term patients in the long-term care unit, many of them being elders. People detained at Orleans Parish Prison, or OPP, suffered some of the worst injustices during Katrina. Despite the mayor's mandatory evacuation order, people detained at OPP remained at the facility which flooded. They were left without food, water, ventilation, or any means to leave to protect themselves. Katrina is considered the costliest hurricane on record, totaling $161 billion in damages. But the true toll went far beyond dollars, falling heaviest on those already marginalized, including people with disabilities. The water is rushing in. These are the last words Benilda Caixeta, or Benny to her friends, said on the phone before the line went dead. Benny was born in Brazil on January 31, 1950. She was incredibly creative and was known for her sewing skills and talents in creating wedding dresses and carnival costumes. Benny left Brazil and immigrated to the United States, seeking treatment after she developed a rare form of muscular dystrophy as a teenager that required her to use an electric wheelchair. Pam Mining, a dear friend of Benny's, fondly remembered that Benny had a zest for life. She enjoyed life, you know. She loved chocolates and coffee and smoking her cigarettes. Benny was a fiercely independent person and was a dedicated volunteer and advocate. Benny really valued her independence. She worked hard to do everything she could on her own, from cooking to washing dishes to making her own clothing. Benny was also an advocate for others with disabilities. Pam recalled, she wanted other people with disabilities to have comfortable lives, to make sure they were protected, that people didn't take advantage of them. So Benny worked with a variety of groups dedicated to advocating for those with disabilities, giving her time and talents to assist others. In August 2005, when the residents of New Orleans were told to evacuate, Benny made arrangements to be picked up via paratransit to be taken to a local shelter. Her ride never showed, though. So Benny took to the phones, reaching out to organizations, services, really anyone who might be able to help her evacuate. She called everyone she could think of for 2 days straight, but the city had been shut down and there was no one available to pick her up and take her to the Superdome. Benny and her personal assistant were forced to bunker down in Benny's first-floor apartment and wait out the storm. The power went out, but Benny was able to call and speak to a few friends and receive updates from the storm even after her radio had died. Then the levees, just a few blocks from Benny's apartment, failed, and the 9th District of New Orleans flooded. Benny told a friend on the phone that the water was rushing in, and then the line went dead. Benny gave her assistant her phone and address book and directed her to save herself. This left Benny alone, with no phone, in her motorized wheelchair to face the flooding alone. 3 days later, Benny's assistant was airlifted off of a roof. Weeks later, Benny was found after she had drowned in her apartment, wearing clothes she had made herself. Benny Caixeta's death was an absolute tragedy. but sadly many people experienced similar fates, like Aileen Bonds, who was required to use a wheelchair, who died from complications after being stranded on an overpass for days, or Howard's 73-year-old mother who suffered from Parkinson's, who was unable to evacuate and was turned away from the Superdome because their, quote, special needs section wasn't ready to accommodate her. She died shortly after being pulled from the floodwaters. Katrina demonstrated that there was a huge deficit in support and services for people with disabilities during disasters. The National Council on Disabilities estimated that there were 155,000 people with disabilities over the age of 5 located in the 3 cities impacted the most by Katrina. And the Center for Disease Control estimated that nearly 500,000 people with disabilities lived in the parts of Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama that were impacted by the storm. During every phase of the disaster, before it struck the United States, during the storm, and in its aftermath, people with disabilities were excluded from emergency planning and response, leaving vital access and support out of reach for many. Before the storm reached the United States, local, state, and federal officials failed to effectively communicate, especially to people with sensory disabilities. Emergency broadcasts failed to have closed captioning or sign language interpreters, making it difficult for people with hearing disabilities to access the information. People with visual disabilities also struggled because vital information was conveyed in maps and graphics that lacked audio descriptions. The Federal Communications Commission sent a reminder to broadcasters to comply with accessibility laws, but it failed to encourage much change. Even the Department of Homeland Security had to be told that their websites, which also included the Federal Emergency Management Agency, or FEMA, were non-compliant. This was rectified after the issue was brought to the agency's attention. These issues meant that some people did not have the necessary information to make informed decisions about whether to evacuate or when to leave and how. As we saw in Benny's case, many people with disabilities who were able to receive information about the evacuation struggled to find transportation options. There was a severe lack of accessible transportation options and assistance for people who needed it. Some people who were able to reach bus stops on the evacuation routes got there only to find out that the buses were not equipped with ramps or lifts. Others were denied transportation or access to shelters because they had service animals. In an article entitled Katrina's Animal Legacy, the Pets Act, published in the Journal of American Law and Ethics, the authors state, evacuation and rescue plans did not take into account pets and service animals, and existing laws did not require such planning provisions. People like Benny reached out to paratransit for support, but were never picked up. Marcy Roth of the Spinal Cord Injury Association testified in Congress following Katrina and shared Benny's story. When talking about Benny's transportation, she said, she kept telling me she'd been calling for a ride to the Superdome since Saturday, but despite promises, no one came. The very same paratransit system that people can't rely on in good weather is what was being relied on in the evacuation. Situations like this could have been avoided if people with disabilities were consulted in the creation of emergency plans from the start. People with disabilities also had more limited access to shelters. Some people were segregated in separate sections of shelters, while others were denied entry altogether. When Marcy Roth with the American Spinal Cord Injury Association found that people with disabilities were being turned away from shelters, she called the American Red Cross, who oversaw approximately 1,300 shelters nationwide. An employee told Marcy, "Our shelters are not for them. There are places for them, run by local health departments, but still busloads of them kept being dropped off at our American Red Cross shelters. We can't hardly serve the intact people." Wow. In another National Council on Disability report, it was found that people with psychiatric disabilities were also denied entry to shelters due to, quote, erroneous fears and stereotypes of people with psychiatric disabilities. In some regions, the health department established what were called, quote, special needs shelters. They were created to accommodate people with chronic illnesses, people who were homebound, and or people who needed continued care. While it's important that these services were available, it would have behooved organizers to have them as units in other shelters. Instead, these separate shelters came as an excuse for other shelters to discriminate against people with disabilities by denying people access. Shelters also were just generally inaccessible, They lacked resources like ramps, lifts, and communication aids for people with sensory disabilities. Some of the most devastating failures in emergency planning occurred in nursing homes and hospitals in New Orleans. And while it is important to note that not everyone in nursing homes and hospitals consider themselves disabled, I do think it's important to include it in this section. Less than 60% of nursing homes in the city were successful in evacuating patients. In some cases, residents were completely abandoned, left to navigate the floodwaters on their own. Many patients in hospitals also had horrifying experiences. In her book, 5 Days at Memorial, Life and Death in a Storm-Ravaged Hospital, Sherry Fink shares the experiences of hospital staff and patients at Memorial Medical Center in New Orleans. Memorial Medical Center was a place where residents of the city often sought shelter during storms and emergencies, but due to the location of the backup generators and the things that they needed, just 4 feet of floodwaters knocked out the facility's power. Patients were triaged into 3 categories: those that could walk, those who needed assistance, and finally those who were considered critically ill. Without power, the medical staff began ventilating patients manually for hours, and temperatures inside the building began to soar, reaching 110 degrees. Food and water supplies began to reach concerning levels, and more people flocked to the hospital, some in boats, to seek refuge. While I won't go into all the details, I definitely recommend checking out Fink's book if you're interested in medical ethics. What I will say, though, is that she demonstrates that hospitals impacted by Katrina also seriously lacked realistic emergency plans, and it cost people their lives. It's important to note that each of these issues, access to communications, reliable transportation, proper care of nursing home residents and hospital patients, were all issues prior to Katrina that were exacerbated by the storm. Paratransit was notoriously unreliable on good days, and not all public buses had ramps or lifts. Nursing homes were also a huge issue in New Orleans prior to Katrina. A National Council on Disabilities report published in 2006 states that in the 6 years immediately preceding the hurricanes, the majority of Louisiana nursing homes were cited for harming or endangering residents. It's also important to note that while these issues of access were very visible in urban centers like New Orleans, they were also just as dire, if not more so, for people with disabilities living in rural areas in Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama who already struggled with access to services like internet, phone service, and transportation prior to the storm. So why does it matter? And what changed following Hurricane Katrina to ensure that catastrophes like this don't happen again? I think the best place to start in examining why this matters is with a quote from Adrienne Wigan, who is the Associate Director of Training at Movement Lab. In the documentary, The Right to be Rescued, Adrienne said, "No disasters are natural. When you know in advance who is likely to be the most harmed in a disaster and you don't do anything about it, then that is a choice. It's about whose lives are more valuable and which ones aren't as valuable." And they're right. As we have seen in the case of Caixeta, countless nursing home residents, and others, there was no plan made to support people with disabilities who lived in the path of Katrina. Transportation plans lacked options for people who used wheelchairs. Emergency alerts were not always accessible to those with visual or hearing impairments. Patients and nursing home residents were stuck at facilities for days with no powers or plans to evacuate, and emergency shelters lacked the basics in accessibility. Simply put, life-preserving accommodations were neglected, and it cost people their lives. So what changed? And what work is still needed to be done? Following the devastation of Katrina, Congress began to make changes as reports of mismanagement, extreme failures, and injustices were being reported through agencies and in congressional hearings. On October 4, 2006, President George H.W. Bush signed into law the Post-Katrina Emergency Management Reform Act. The act addressed the federal shortcomings in emergency planning and response following the storm. FEMA's role in emergency management was better defined, 10 regional offices for multi-agent strike teams were formed, and it called for the establishment of the National Advisory Council on Preparedness and Response. It also required the appointment of a disability coordinator to ensure that the needs of individuals with disabilities were being addressed in emergency planning and relief efforts. It also codified that people with disabilities need to be considered in emergency planning so that communications, transportation, shelter, and housing are accessible, and it expressly prohibits discrimination based on disabilities in disaster assistance. In September 2005, after thousands of pets were abandoned due to Hurricane Katrina and thousands of people failed to evacuate because of their furry companions, Representative Todd Lantos of California and Senator Ted Stevens of Arkansas introduced the Pets Evacuation and Transportation Standards Act, or the PETS Act. This act amended the Stafford Act and required state emergency preparedness efforts to include pets and service animals. It was passed with overwhelming support in October of 2006. At the local and state levels, New Orleans and Louisiana made changes in hopes of addressing the failures of emergency planning and response following the storm. The city established the Special Needs Registry, which is now part of the city's Smart 911 profiles. Here, residents can sign up for emergency alerts and share if they require life support systems, have difficulties with mobility or require mobility aids, have sensory disabilities, or any other information so response teams know where people who might require specialized support are located. Louisiana established the Coastal Protection and Restoration Authority, which is charged with maintaining the state's coastlines in order to protect communities and natural resources. Part of the authority's work is to fortify the levees and to create flood walls. Together, the city and the state have also worked to improve infrastructure like drainage to help mitigate flooding in the future. Despite these changes, there is still work to be done. In cities all over the country, including Los Angeles, San Antonio, Virginia Beach, and others, people with disabilities, advocacy organizations, and even the Justice Department have sued or reached settlements to demand that emergency plans include people with disabilities. These lawsuits and settlements are likely to continue until local and state plans include all people who call them home. Thank you for listening to Clarissa Explains. I know today's episode might have been a little heavy, but when you're talking about disasters, sometimes that happens, so thank you for sticking it out with me today. If you enjoyed today's episode, please be sure to follow and leave a review so fellow history lovers can find us. And for show notes on today's episode or more information about the show, please visit our website at ClarissaExplains.org. Until next time, remember, understanding history starts with asking the right questions, and we are here to explain it one story at a time.